Despite its age, the Atari 2600 is about as far from a dead platform as you can get. To this very day, we regularly see homebrew releases from talented independent devs who are working within the constraints of the 2600, creating brand new and interesting games and ports of older games. Plus, we periodically will see old prototypes that maybe didn't get completed, sometimes for good reason. I think about things like the attempt at Tempest. Stunt Cycle is one that probably should have come out and just never did due to circumstances that we won't get into here. So that means it's not necessarily unusual that a new or even old title surfaces for us to play with and enjoy. But every once in a while, something truly remarkable surfaces, and that's what's happened in this case. I want to talk to you about a rare gem that was recently discovered from the early days of Atari, a battleship-style game called Sonar that, while it never saw release, employed a technology in the 2600 that was removed before its 1977 launch. I'm going to tell you all about it and how you can play it for free today, right after this. This video supported in part by...
Playing VR, I tend to sweat. It gives me an edge. So King of Nerds happens to give me an edge too. Let King of Nerds give you the edge. Bye, King of Nerds.
Hey there, welcome back to GenXGrownUp. I am John and I am a GenXGrownUp. Thank you so much for the click. Atari developer Brad Stewart started his tenure at Atari in May of 1977. Now, you probably know him from titles like Breakout and Asteroids that he was the developer on. Even though Atari didn't give credit, we now know who developed those games, and he was the author of those hits. During his time at Atari, Stewart worked on numerous projects, and sometimes projects just don't get released. That's common in any kind of software development, really. And one of those projects he recalls was a battleship-style game. Though he doesn't remember ever finishing it, it was just kind of in its early stages. But just last year, a battleship-style game called Sonar was discovered. It was in the property of a former Atari R&D employee. It looked like, connect the dots, this is probably the battleship-style game that Stewart was working on. Now, it was shown to Stewart, and he thinks maybe it's not the one he worked on, so it's possible that yes, he worked on it, didn't finish it, and someone tried to finish it, or it could be that someone was working in parallel on another battleship-style game, or it could just be that Brad Stewart's memory is not what it used to be, and 45 years later, I wouldn't blame him. Whichever of these is the case is largely irrelevant. The bottom line, what we do know, is that this game, just discovered last year and just released last week, called Sonar, definitely came out of Atari in the very, very early days of the life of the 2600. So, what is Sonar? I'm glad you asked. Sonar does have a passing resemblance to Battleship, but unlike Battleship, where there are boats and subs around the map and you are firing on them from above, in this case, you are a ship that is sailing around a grid trying to locate submarines under the water to drop depth charges and blow them up. Now, if all I can see is water and boats, how do I know if I've hit anything? How do I find these subs to blow up? It's in the name. Sonar. There is a constant ping being sent out by your boat, and you listen for the return of the sonar. You get a ding, and then you get a chime back if you are within the range, within a space or two of one of the submarines. And then by deduction, you move around and determine where the ping doesn't happen and where it does, and you drop a depth charge, and hopefully you hit one of those subs. Now, despite just being a prototype, it seems like Sonar was pretty far along before it got shelved. It has 16 game variations, including combinations of things like penalties for missed shots or a limited number of shots, an invisible map, or even mines, in addition to the submarines floating around underneath the water that you can get penalties for dropping a depth charge on. Like many the very early Atari 2600 games, this game is intended to only be a two-player game. That's not particularly uncommon, right? So if I'm playing two players and we're both on the map at the same time and we're listening for a return from our sonar ping to know whether or not we're close to a submarine, how on earth do the two players know which ping is for them? It's because this game, Sonar, was originally developed and required stereo audio. So you might ask yourself, and rightfully so, why on earth was there ever even a prototype? Why would you start developing a game that required a feature that was not even in the Atari 2600? That's an excellent question, and it has a really good answer that I'm going to tell you in just a minute. First, though, let me just remind you that since late last year, I have been unemployed and dumping all of my time and energy into making GenXGrownUp potentially a full-time job. If you enjoy the work that we do here on the channel or over on the podcast, let me just ask that you consider supporting us financially. You can go to genxgrownup.com/Patreon and pledge for as little as $1 a month. Help us out a little bit. If you don't want a commitment like that, you could always click that little thanks button underneath the video for a one-time donation. We very much would appreciate that. If none of that is good for you, maybe consider doing something free. Share this video out with someone you think might enjoy it on social or anything like that. We would very much be appreciated. Okay, let's talk about the stereo game on the mono Atari. If you listen closely to me playing Sonar here, you can see that ping returns are coming both from the left and right speaker. How in the world is that possible? Well, I'll tell you how it's possible. When it was designed, the Atari 2600 was initially not only supposed to support stereo sound, but have two speakers inside of the console that would provide that stereo sound. Now, this is something that was written off and removed from the Atari before it launched in September of 1977. But if you have an NTSC Atari 2600, the TIA, or Television Interface Adapter chip, still has two pins that reference audio 0 and audio 1. That's stereo sound. So initially the 2600 was gonna have stereo, but before it was ever released, they got rid of it. So if your console doesn't support stereo either internally or externally, and you're developing a game for launch that uses stereo, requires stereo, it's no surprise why this got shelved. So it's right about this point you're probably thinking to yourself or yelling at your screen, John, if the Atari does not support stereo sound, how on earth could we play Sonar if it requires stereo to be played? And since it was part of the original design for the Atari, that feature has been implemented in many emulators. In my case, I'm using Stella, a great Atari 2600 emulator. And if you open up the options and go to audio video and over to the audio tab, there's a tick box to enable stereo sound on all ROMs if they are available. Okay, so now you have a tick box that's only good for Sonar. Do you know what I learned in the course of preparing for this video to talk about Sonar? There were two other games, launch titles for the 2600 that also support stereo. I did not know that until like today. Combat and Air Sea Battle both utilize stereo sound. If you enable this tick box in Stella, everything that's done by the left player goes in the left speaker, everything done by the right player goes in the right speaker. That includes driving or shooting or blowing things up or getting shot. Now there's nothing fancy like panning left to right when you move across the screen, it's just really segregated audio that allows you to hear what sound is coming from which player. And clearly it was never utilized because no stereo sound in the console, but you can try it out in Stella today if you want. And finally, you might be asking yourself why anybody cares about this 40-plus-year-old abandoned game. Well, I'll tell you why I care, and you can decide for yourself. Look, this is not a ROM hack. This is not a homebrew. This is not a third-party title. This came from inside Atari, being manufactured and programmed by Atari, by Atari developers before the Atari was ever launched. In a parallel universe, this could very well be one of the 10 launch titles. There were 9. Imagine if you grew up with 9 siblings and you loved them all and they were fantastic. And then you find out 45 years later, there was a 10th sibling who was born at the same time, but never got out, never saw the light of day, never got the chance to grow up. But you're gonna love them just as much because they come from the same stock. They are equal brethren to you. The article over at Atari Protos even suggests that this was written in 1979, but I've got to think that all the work was done on it 1977, before the launch of the 2600. If you know that stereo sound is not available in the shipping product, why would you even spend a minute developing a piece of software that requires that stereo? I don't think you would. In some other branch of the multiverse, where the speakers were never taken out of the 2600 at all, Sonar is one of the 10 launch titles. We would look at it right beside things like Combat and Air Sea Battle and Starship and things that we know so well that came out at launch time. This would have equal footing with those, but for the fact that there was a hardware decision to save a little money and pull those speakers out. The ROM to play Sonar was made publicly available just last week, and in the description of this video, I will place links to not only all the articles that I used as research to prepare for this video, but also that link to Atari Age where you can go and download that ROM and play it right now, today. Now keep in mind, as I said, it's just a prototype. It was never fully finished. In fact, the subs don't even have randomization, so each time you play, they're in the same place, so not a lot of replay value right now, although as I think about it, it could be that some talented homebrew author might grab that ROM and expand upon it, add the randomization. I don't know, maybe, perhaps. Now, Sonar is not likely to knock your socks off when you play it. It's very rudimentary in design, even by Atari 2600 standards, but it's a remarkable gem, a time capsule of early Atari design. And if you are a lifelong Atari 2600 fan like I am, I think you'll enjoy at least giving it a try. I will throw some links over my shoulders here and here to some other great Atari videos that we have produced here at GenXGrownUp. I certainly hope you found something to enjoy in this video though, and I can't wait to talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.